At 7:58 a.m., Arthur Sterling, a man whose name was forged in the steel and glass of the New York skyline, held a fountain pen heavier than most men's ambitions. The pen, a gift from his late wife, was poised over a document that would sign away not just his $90 billion empire, Sterling Industries, but the very meaning of his 80 years on this earth. He was about to declare himself a ghost, the last monarch of a fallen kingdom. Across the vast obsidian table, Julian Vance, his chief operating officer and the son he never had, watched with a perfectly calibrated expression of sorrow. Flanking Julian was a phalanx of stone-faced lawyers from Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen and Katz, the best corporate executioners money could buy. The papers before Arthur were a 2,000-page eulogy for a life's work, a formal surrender to an enemy he couldn't see. But Arthur wasn't looking at the papers. His gaze was fixed on a young woman standing almost invisibly in the corner of the boardroom, near the polished chrome coffee service. She wore a cheap, ill-fitting black uniform, her face pale with exhaustion. The waitress, the girl who, just 3 hours earlier, had served him a burnt cup of coffee in a greasy spoon diner, and, with a trembling finger, pointed to a single, venomous clause buried on page 1132. A clause that wasn't a mistake. It was a dagger, coated in 30 years of trust, and aimed directly at his heart. The neon sign outside the Lamplight Diner was supposed to read 24-hour service, but the Vice had sputtered and died last winter, leaving it to ominously promise 24-hour sir. It was a haven for the city's insomniacs, its graveyard shift workers, and its ghosts. At 4:17 a.m., Clara Evans felt like all three. She methodically wiped down the cracked linoleum counter, the acrid smell of industrial cleaner a poor mask for the decades of fried bacon and despair soaked into the diner's very bones. Each swipe of her rag felt like sanding down another minute of her own life. 5 years ago, Clara Evans wasn't wiping down counters. She was a senior paralegal in the Mergers and Acquisitions division of Skadden, Arps, a titan of corporate law. She was the one the partners called their secret weapon, the one with an almost supernatural ability to read the dense, labyrinthine language of contracts and find the hidden traps, the poison pills, the subtle shifts in syntax that could turn a billion-dollar deal into a corporate ambush. She didn't just read contracts. She saw their architecture, the load-bearing clauses, and the decorative deceptions. She had a gift for seeing the malice in the margins. Then, life had performed its signature move, a brutal, clean sweep of the legs. Her father, a proud history professor who had raised her alone after her mother's death, was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. It was a vicious, fast-moving strain. The insurance, a gold-plated plan from her law firm, was formidable, but the disease was relentless. The experimental treatments, the 24-hour specialized care, the consultants, it was a financial tsunami. Clara's 6-figure salary, once a source of pride, became a sandcastle against the tide. She sold her condo. She liquidated her portfolio, her 401k, her future, and when that was gone, she needed cash. Now, the 80-hour work weeks of high-stakes M&A were impossible while coordinating her father's care. So she traded her tailored suits for a polyester uniform that always smelled faintly of fryer oil, and her meticulous legal analysis for taking orders for coffee, black, and eggs over easy. The tips she crumpled into her pocket each night were the only thing keeping her father in a facility that treated him with dignity, instead of just warehousing him until the end. The jingle of the bell over the door cut through the quiet hum of the diner. A man entered, though it looked more like he had been shoved through the door by the weight of the world. He wasn't a regular. He was old money, the kind that was so ingrained It didn't need to be flashy. His overcoat was a heavy, dark cashmere that probably cost more than the diner's monthly lease. But it was thrown on over a rumpled suit, and his face, etched with the kind of deep lines that speak of power and sleepless nights, was the color of old ash. His eyes, a startlingly sharp blue, were hollowed out, consumed by a dread so profound it seemed to suck the very light from the room. He looked like a general who had just been forced to surrender his own sword. This was Arthur Sterling. Clara didn't recognize him. The titans of industry were no longer her concern. To her, he was just another weary soul in booth 4. He didn't slide into the booth. He collapsed into it, the red vinyl sighing under his weight. He dropped a massive leather-bound binder onto the table. It landed with a sound of utter finality, a coffin lid closing. "Whiskey," he rasped, his voice a gravelly ruin. "If you have it. If not, coffee." "Coffee it is," Clara said, her own voice a monotone of fatigue. "We're a diner, not a wake." The corner of his mouth twitched, a flicker of a smile that died before it was born. She returned with a thick, chipped ceramic mug and the diner's famously bitter brew. He ignored her, having already opened the binder. His hand, adorned with a simple, heavy gold wedding band, trembled not with age, but with a violent, suppressed rage. Clara moved back behind the counter, feigning business with the sugar packets. It was a habit she couldn't break, the professional detached observation of a subject, and her subject in booth 4 was disintegrating. He stared at the pages, but he wasn't reading. He was bearing witness to his own execution. He would pick up his pen, an old, elegant Mont Blanc, hover it over a signature line, then set it down with a soft, defeated sigh. His phone, a sleek, modern smartphone, buzzed on the table. The screen lit up again and again with the same name. Julian Vance. After the 5th buzz, the old man snatched it up. "What, Julian? Is it not enough that you've called me every 15 minutes? To make sure the condemned man is walking to the gallows on schedule?" His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that carried in the near-empty diner. Clara froze, a napkin in her hand. "No, I haven't signed it yet. I'm reviewing." The word was a lie, and they both knew it. "Yes, I know the meeting is at 8. I know the board is waiting. I know Thorne and his vultures from Apex are sharpening their beaks. You don't need to remind me that this is the end of Sterling Industries. I was there when my wife and I laid the first brick." A long, terrible pause. The man's face seemed to shrink, to fold in on itself. "Just leave me be. I'll be there. I will sign the damned papers." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the opposite seat, as if it were contaminated. He buried his face in his hands, his formidable shoulders shaking with a silent, racking sob. Clara felt an unwelcome stir of her old self. The analytical mind, the puzzle solver, was being roused from its slumber, wrapped in a blanket of simple human empathy. Sterling Industries. Of course, she knew the name. An institution, aerospace, advanced materials, medical technology. They were one of the last great American industrial giants, and this man was its patriarch, about to be unceremoniously dethroned. He looked up, and his piercing blue eyes, now red-rimmed and raw, met hers. "What are you staring at, girl?" he snapped, his grief curdling into anger. "Nothing, sir," Clara said, her voice soft. "Just looks like a long night." "You have no idea," he muttered, turning back to the binder. "It's not the night. It's the morning I'm afraid of." He gestured vaguely at the menu taped to the wall. "Get me whatever. Toast. Something to soak up this poison you call coffee." Clara nodded and went to the grill, as she dropped 2 slices of rye bread into the toaster. She couldn't shake the image of the man and his legal tombstone. This wasn't just a bankruptcy. His words on the phone, the mention of thorn and apex, it smelled like something else. It smelled like a takeover, a hostile one. The documents would be the final shareholder agreement, the asset transfer, the corporate death certificate. She brought him the toast. He didn't touch it. He was staring at a page deep within the binder, his finger tracing a dense paragraph. "This is it," he whispered to himself, his voice thick with a horrifying cocktail of fury and helplessness. "The whole damn thing hinges on this one clause, the one that ties my hands." He waved a dismissive, trembling hand for more coffee. Clara approached the table, pot in hand. It was now 5:30 a.m. The sky outside was shifting from black to a bruised, unforgiving purple. The 8 a.m. deadline was no longer an abstraction. It was a rapidly approaching freight train. As she leaned over to pour, her sleeve, damp from the sink, brushed against the corner of the binder. It was a clumsy, exhausted move. At that exact moment, Arthur, lost in his despair, slammed a fist softly on the table, a gesture of pure frustration. The combination was just enough. The heavy mug wobbled, tipped, and a wave of hot black coffee surged across the table, a dark tide heading straight for the priceless, execution-ready legal documents. "No! You clumsy fool!" Arthur roared, jolting to his feet. "I'm so sorry, sir, I'm so sorry," Clara gasped, grabbing a handful of thin paper napkins. She lunged, her instincts taking over, not just to save the papers but to see them. Her hand, moving with a speed that belied her exhaustion, covered the critical page he had been staring at, shielding it from the worst of the spill. She began to dab at the spreading pool of liquid, her heart pounding. This was it. She was going to be fired from a job she already hated, losing the pittance she so desperately needed. "Get away from it," he yelled. "You've probably ruined it. They'll claim it's been tampered with. It'll just give them more leverage." I'm trying to dry it," Clara insisted, her hands moving with a strange, forgotten precision. And that's when she saw it. Her eyes, trained by years of dissecting legal documents under relentless pressure, scanned the paragraph her hand was protecting. It wasn't just a random page. It was Section 9, Subsection C, Conditions Precedent to Asset Transfer. It was a dense block of text, but 3 lines leapt out at her, as if printed in blood. Upon the activation of the Nightingale Protocol, all voting rights of Class A shares held by the Sterling Family Trust shall be suspended, pending independent valuation, and the board shall be granted immediate and irrevocable authority to execute the asset sale to Apex Consolidated. Clara's blood didn't just run cold, it turned to ice. Her hand stopped moving. The coffee-soaked napkin hovered an inch from the page. Nightingale Protocol. It wasn't standard legal language. It was bespoke. It was a weapon. It was a term she had seen once before, in a very different context. "What is it now?" Arthur spat, misinterpreting her pause as incompetence. "Did the ink run? Is it illegible?" Clara didn't hear him. She was no longer in the lamplight diner. She was 5 years in the past, in a glass-walled conference room at Skadden Arps, sitting across from a younger, more vibrant Arthur Sterling. He was there to set up a charitable trust in his late wife's name, Eleanor, who had been a passionate advocate for healthcare reform. He wanted to call it the Nightingale Foundation. She remembered the preliminary drafts, the corporate structures she had helped design. She looked up from the page, her eyes wide with a terrifying clarity, and met Arthur Sterling's furious gaze. "Sir," she whispered, her voice shaking not with fear, but with dawning horror. "This protocol, Who drafted it? Arthur Sterling stared at the waitress, his grief-addled mind struggling to pass the question. What? He snarled, pulling the binder from under her hand. He squinted at the page. The coffee had stained the margins a dark brown, but her hand had saved the text itself. What are you talking about? It's part of the agreement. My COO, Julian Vance, negotiated it. It's a standard crisis management clause, he said, to protect the company from a hostile move if my health failed. No, Clara said, her voice gaining a strange, resonant authority. She pointed a trembling finger at the page. It's not a shield, Mr. Sterling, it's a cage, the Nightingale Protocol. It doesn't protect the company. It strips you of your power. It's a kill switch for your voting rights. And it's not triggered by your health. Read the activation criteria. A thick, dangerous silence descended on the diner. The only sounds were the distant sizzle of the grill and the hum of the ancient refrigerator. Arthur, his anger momentarily forgotten, followed her finger. He read the lines that followed the clause, lines he had glossed over 100 times. Assured by Julian, they were boilerplate. The protocol could be activated by a simple majority vote of the non-executive board members if the company faced a Class 3 market exigency, a term so vague and open to interpretation it was legally meaningless. Julian told me, he began, his voice faltering. He said Apex was making a hostile play, that our stock was vulnerable, that the board was panicking. He said this was the only way to stabilize things, to agree to a friendly, structured sale. He said this clause gave me the power to control the process. He lied, Clara said flatly. The name Julian Vance was the final, sickening piece of the puzzle. Of course, the brilliant protégé, the one who had always been there. Arthur stepped back from the table, his eyes truly seeing her for the first time. The cheap uniform, the exhaustion, the faint smell of bleach and coffee. Who in God's name are you? My name is Clara Evans, she said, the fog of her sleepless night burning away, replaced by the cold, clear fire of professional outrage. And 5 years ago, I was the senior paralegal at Skadden who helped you draft the initial charter for your wife's charitable foundation, the Eleanor Nightingale Foundation. She tapped the paper. I helped design the corporate structure for that foundation, a structure designed to be independent, with a board that could act decisively. Julian Vance was in those meetings. He has taken the exact legal framework we designed for a charity and weaponized it against you. He's not protecting your company from Apex. He's serving it to them on a silver platter, and this document is his guarantee that you are powerless to stop him. Arthur Sterling sank back into the vinyl booth, his legs giving way. The air left his lungs in a ragged gasp. You're telling me the centerpiece of my own surrender was my wife's legacy? Yes, Clara said, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. And you said Julian negotiated this. Think, Mr. Sterling. He presents you with a threat, Apex's hostile bid. He creates the crisis. Then he presents you with the solution, this friendly sale, governed by a crisis protocol named after your wife, knowing you'd be too emotional, too trusting, to scrutinize it. He's not your advisor. He's the architect of your downfall. He built the Trojan horse, named it after your wife, and convinced you to pull it inside the gates yourself. Arthur was breathing heavily, his face a mask of dawning horror. But why? Julian, I treated him like a son. He has millions in stock. If the company is sold for a lowball price to Apex, he loses everything. Does he? Clara challenged, her mind racing, connecting the dots with practiced speed. Or does Apex give him a massive golden parachute for delivering the company so cheaply? Or more likely, a significant equity stake in the newly combined entity and the CEO position he's always coveted. He's not losing, he's trading his inheritance for the throne. The entire, horrifyingly elegant betrayal played out in Arthur's mind. Julian creates the panic. He uses his position to convince the board that a lowball offer from Apex is their only salvation. He designs the legal trap using a framework he knows Arthur trusts implicitly. Once Arthur signs, his own voting power is neutralized. The board, guided by Julian, rubber stamps the sale to Apex. Julian gets a massive payout and the CEO chair. He wasn't just selling the company out from under Arthur. He was using the memory of Arthur's wife to do it. Arthur Sterling looked at the cheap plastic clock on the diner wall. 5:52 a.m. "The meeting is at 8 o'clock, he said, his voice flat and dead. "The signing, in my boardroom. Julian will be there. The lawyers, Marcus Thorne from Apex." "They're all in the same room," Clara said. "How efficient for them." "If I accuse him, he'll deny it," Arthur said, thinking aloud, the old strategic mind beginning to stir beneath the grief. "It's my word against his. This clause." He gestured at the document. "The lawyers from Wachtell Lipton approved it. They'll say I signed it of my own free will, that I was of sound mind." "They were either incompetent or complicit," Clara stated. "But you're right. He's insulated himself. He's used the system to legitimize the crime. We can't prove his intent." Her brow furrowed. There was always a trail. Arrogant men always left a trail. But he had to coordinate this. With Apex, with the board members he swayed. He wouldn't do that on a company phone. "How do we find it?" Arthur asked. He was no longer speaking to a waitress. He was speaking to his last and only ally. "How do we find proof in 2 hours?" Clara's mind ignited. The diner, her aching feet, her own desperate situation, it all evaporated. She was back. "We can't prove intent, not yet. But we can prove conspiracy. You have your phone, you have access. You need to make one call. Not to anyone at Sterling, not to your lawyers. They're compromised. You need someone completely loyal. Someone outside the corporate structure." Arthur nodded slowly. "Margaret. My executive assistant for 40 years. She retired last year, but she'd take a bullet for me. She lives in Scarsdale." "Call her," Clara commanded, grabbing a clean napkin and Arthur's Mont Blanc pen. "Wake her up. Tell her you need her to do one last job for you. She must still have access to your personal archives, your private server, not the main Sterling Industries network. Julian's IT people will have that locked down." "She does," Arthur said, his fingers already dialing. "She manages my personal trust. What am I looking for?" "You need 2 things," Clara said, scribbling on the napkin. "First, you need her to search your encrypted email archives for any communication between Julian Vance and Marcus Thorne of Apex Consolidated in the last 6 months. Specifically, look for anything on his private email address, not his corporate one. He's arrogant, but not stupid enough to use the company server for this." Arthur began barking orders into the phone, his voice regaining its old, crisp authority. "Margaret, wake up. It's Arthur. I need you. Code black." Clara continued. "Second, and this is the key. You need her to search for any communication related to Nightingale." He had to have tested the name, the concept. Look for drafts, memos, anything. But tell her to search the metadata. Not just the text of the documents. Look for creation dates, author IDs, and more importantly, look for hidden comments or tracked changes in early drafts of the sales agreement. Lawyers and executives, they get lazy. They think they've scrubbed a document, but the history is often still buried in the file's data. We're looking for a digital fingerprint, a link between Julian and Apex that predates the crisis he manufactured. Arthur relayed the instructions. Clara, what if there's nothing? What if he was as careful as he is cruel? He wasn't, Clara said with absolute certainty. Men like Julian, the ones who crave power this desperately, they have an ego. They believe they're smarter than everyone else. That ego makes them sloppy. He's proud of this scheme. He'll have left a piece of himself on it somewhere. I promise you. Arthur hung up the phone. He and Clara stared at each other in the harsh, buzzing light of the lamplight diner. The first of the morning's commuters were beginning to trickle in, oblivious to the $90 billion corporate war being waged from Booth 4. Now what? Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. Now, Clara said, refilling his coffee mug, her hand as steady as a surgeon's. You drink your coffee. We have about an hour before we know if you're a king or a pauper. She pushed the plate of cold toast towards him. And you should eat. You're going to need your strength for the battle ahead. The next 60 minutes stretched into an eternity. The lamplight diner, once a refuge, became a holding cell on death row. Every time the bell on the door jingled, Arthur flinched. He stared at the phone on the table, a dark, silent oracle that held his fate. Clara, in stark contrast, was a study in controlled calm. She moved through the diner, a ghost in a black uniform, taking orders, pouring coffee. But her focus, her entire being, was tethered to the man in booth 4. Every few minutes, she would pass his table and murmur, "She'll find it. Pride goeth before a fall." At 6:58 a.m., the phone vibrated, a violent, jarring buzz against the formica. Arthur snatched it up. "Margaret, tell me." He put the call on speaker. Margaret's voice, sharp and clear despite the hour, crackled through the phone. "Arthur, I'm in. I had to use my old admin credentials through a back door, but I'm in your private archives. The emails... Oh, Arthur, it's worse than you think." Clara leaned in, wiping down an adjacent table, her ears straining. "The emails, Margaret," Arthur pressed. "I found a chain," she said, the sound of furious clicking in the background. "Between Julian's private Gmail account and a shell address that routes to Marcus Thorne's personal server. It started 4 months ago, long before the stock dip. They weren't discussing a hostile bid, Arthur. They were planning it. Julian was feeding Thorne information about Sterling's minor supply chain vulnerabilities, telling him exactly how to spook the market to create the exigency he needed." Clara closed her eyes and took a deep, steadying breath. It was the whole playbook, conspiracy from the ground up. "And the agreement?" Clara whispered. "The document?" "I found it," Margaret said, her voice trembling with rage on Arthur's behalf. "The first draft of the sales agreement. It was sent from Thorne to Julian 3 months ago. And you were right, young lady, whoever you are. I looked at the metadata. The original author of the document is listed as M. Thorne. But there are dozens of tracked changes, comments, revisions, all of them made by one user, J. Vance. He didn't just negotiate the deal, Arthur. He helped write the damn thing from Apex's side." "Checkmate," Clara breathed. "He wasn't just a traitor. He was a double agent." "It's circumstantial," Arthur said, the voice of caution trying to fight through the rage. "His lawyers will say it was part of a tough negotiation, that he was playing hardball to get the best deal for Sterling." "He's right," Clara frowned. "It was damning, but a clever lawyer could spin it. They needed the final, undeniable link, the emotional core of the betrayal. Margaret, the name. Nightingale. Did you search for that?" "I did," Margaret said. "There's one other file in the archive with that name. It's not a document. It's an audio file from 2 years ago. The encryption is old, but I can bypass it." "What is it?" Arthur asked. The line was silent for a moment, filled only with more frantic clicking. Then Margaret's voice came back, choked with emotion. "Oh, Arthur, it's a voicemail. From Eleanor. From the hospital, a few days before she passed. She left it for you, but you were on a flight from Tokyo. I saved it to your personal archive." Arthur's face went white. He remembered that trip, the frantic race home. "Play it," he commanded, his voice a shard of glass. Margaret complied. A woman's voice, weak but filled with a clear, unwavering love, filled the small space around the phone. "Arthur, my love, I know you're on your way. I don't have much time. I wanted to talk about our project, our little nightingale. Please, my darling, promise me you'll see it through. Promise me it will be a place of healing, a legacy of kindness, not just of steel and profits. Let it be the thing they remember us for, our song in the night." The message ended. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Clara felt tears welling in her eyes. Arthur Sterling was not crying. His eyes were dry, burning with a cold, righteous fire she had never seen before. He had found his enemy. "Margaret," he said, his voice now dangerously calm, the voice of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. "Email me that audio file and the full email chain with the metadata report. Now, doing it. Then call the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Get Damian Carroll on the line. He's the head of the white-collar crime division. Tell him Arthur Sterling has definitive, incontrovertible proof of securities fraud and conspiracy to defraud, and that I will be handing him the primary conspirator on a platter in exactly 1 hour. Yes, Arthur. One more thing, Margaret. Call my personal security chief, not the corporate drones. My guys. Tell them I want them on the 75th floor, plain clothes, and when I give the signal, they are to seal the boardroom. No one gets in or out." He hung up the phone. The clock on the wall read 7:15 a.m. He looked at Clara. She was just a woman in a cheap uniform, her hair in a messy ponytail with dark circles under her eyes, and she had just handed him back his soul. I have to finish my shift," Clara stammered, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, the harsh reality of her own life flooding back in. "My rent is due Friday." Arthur let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a black, featureless credit card. He flagged down the other waitress, a tired-looking woman named Flo. "Miss," Arthur said, his voice ringing with newfound power, "I'm buying your colleague. For the day." Flo stared at him, bewildered. "This woman," he said, pointing to Clara. "Her time, her expertise. I'm hiring her, effective immediately." He looked at Clara. "You're not finishing your shift. You're not a waitress anymore. You're my new special counsel." He pulled a thick wad of cash from his pocket, peeled off $2,000, and dropped it on the counter. "For the toast, the coffee, and the trouble. The rest is for them." Clara stood frozen, her world tilting on its axis. "Get your coat, Miss Evans," Arthur Sterling said, shrugging on his own cashmere overcoat. The broken old man was gone. In his place stood a Titan, armed for war. "We have a meeting to attend." The private elevator to the 75th floor of Sterling Tower was a silent, mirrored cage, ascending through the clouds with breathless speed. Clara caught her reflection, a pale, stunned woman in a polyester uniform that smelled of coffee and disinfectant. The coffee stain from the spill was a dark bloom over the cheap, stitched logo of the Lamplight Diner. Beside her, Arthur Sterling looked like a marble statue come to life. He had used the private bathroom in his penthouse apartment to splash water on his face and straighten his suit. The transformation was terrifying. He was no longer a victim. He was a vessel of righteous fury. "Mr. Sterling." "Arthur." "I can't go in there," Clara whispered, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "I'm a waitress. They'll laugh at me. They won't listen. You have the proof now. You don't need me." Arthur turned to her, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. "First, you are what you choose to be, and today you are the sharpest legal mind in this building. Second, the proof is not enough. Justice requires theater. They need to see the person who unmasked them. He needs to see you." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime onto a floor of hushed, expensive silence. The air smelled of polished wood and power. A receptionist at a desk, carved from a single piece of granite, looked up, her expression a mask of professional disdain as her eyes swept over Clara. "Mr. Sterling, you're late. Mr. Vance and the Apex representatives are already in the main boardroom." "Thank you, Helen," Arthur said, his voice arctic. He strode down the hall. In front of the massive 20-foot-tall mahogany doors of the boardroom, two large men in discreet, well-tailored suits stood, looking like bored stockbrokers. They were Arthur's personal security. They gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. Arthur nodded back. "Showtime," he murmured to Clara. He pushed open the doors. The room was an altar to capitalism. A 50-foot table of gleaming redwood dominated the space. At the far end, framed by a panoramic view of a sunrise over Central Park, sat Julian Vance. He was the very picture of calm, confident leadership, his face a mask of solemn concern. He was flanked by the Wachtel-Lipton lawyers. On one side of the table sat Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Apex Consolidated, a man with a predator's smile and cold, empty eyes. On the other side sat the non-executive board members, their faces grim and self-important. Every head turned as Arthur entered. A wave of irritation rippled through the room. He was late. Then they saw Clara, and the irritation turned to bewildered contempt. Julian Vance's practiced mask of sorrow cracked into a smirk. "Arthur, you're late. And you've brought catering?" Marcus Thorne let out a low chuckle. "Something like that, Julian," Arthur said, his voice resonating with a strange, cheerful gravity. He walked to his chair at the head of the table, but remained standing. He gestured for Clara to stand near the wall, beside the coffee service, as if she were there to serve them. She did, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. "Arthur, we're on a very tight schedule," Julian said, his voice smooth as silk. "The markets are waiting. We need to project stability. We need to sign." He pushed the heavy, pristine binder down the polished table. "The final execution copy. Your signature, Arthur, and we can put this unfortunate chapter behind us." Arthur looked at the binder. He looked at Julian. "It is a sad day, Julian," he said, his voice laced with an irony so thick it was almost tangible. "The end of a legacy, all because of that clever little clause you designed, the Nightingale Protocol." Zoe watched Julian. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes, for a fraction of a second, narrowed. He was surprised Arthur had used its name. "A necessary evil, Arthur," Julian said smoothly, "a tool to ensure a swift, clean transition and protect shareholder value. As I explained, it was the only way to fend off a truly hostile attack." "Yes, you explained it so well," Arthur mused. "In fact, you've been so thorough, so involved in every detail of this deal with Apex. I'm starting to think you weren't negotiating against them at all. I'm starting to think you were their partner." The temperature in the room dropped by 20 degrees. The lawyer sat bolt upright. Marcus Thorne's predatory smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. Julian laughed, but the sound was brittle. "Arthur, you're exhausted. You're under immense pressure. You're not thinking clearly. That's a slanderous, dangerous accusation." "Am I?" Arthur said, a real smile touching his lips now. "For the first time in months, I think I'm seeing things with perfect clarity." He turned his gaze to Clara, who was standing motionless by the wall. "Miss, would you mind stepping forward?" Julian's eyes flickered with annoyance. "Arthur, what is this? We don't have time for games with the staff." "Oh, she's not staff," Arthur said pleasantly. "Well, not anymore. Julian, Marcus, board members. I'd like you to meet Clara Evans. She's a former M&A paralegal from Scatton, ARPS, and she has some notes on the legal framework of your agreement. Specifically, on the metadata of the color." A tide of ash and bone receded from Julian Vance's face, leaving behind a waxy, translucent mask of disbelief. His eyes, fixed on Clara, were no longer the confident gaze of a prince regent, but the frantic, darting look of a conspirator whose ghost has just walked into the room. He saw her, truly saw her, and in that moment of recognition, the architecture of his entire, meticulously constructed world began to groan under an impossible weight. Clara stepped forward, her movement not an act of aggression, but a simple claiming of space. The cheap polyester of her uniform rustled, a sound as out of place in the sanctified silence of the boardroom as a scream in a library. Her voice, when it came, was devoid of the waitress's weary monotone. It was the voice she had buried 5 years ago, precise, measured, and utterly lethal. "Mr. Vance," she began, her gaze a physical thing, pinning him to his chair. The document history is quite revealing. It indicates that the initial draft of the sales agreement was authored by a user ID linked to Mr. Thorne's private server. Over the subsequent 3 weeks, it was subject to 217 revisions. Every single one of those revisions, including the insertion and refinement of Section 9, subsection C, was made by a user logged in as J. Vance from an off-network IP address registered to a private residence in Greenwich, Connecticut. Julian's mouth opened, a fish gasping for air. He looked to the Wachtel-Lipton lawyers, his eyes pleading. They stared back, their faces carved from ice, their minds already calculating the blast radius of malpractice and complicity. "Furthermore," Clara continued, her cadence unchanging, "a forensic analysis of your private email server, cross-referenced with subpoenaed cell tower data, reveals 137 communications with Mr. Thorne over the past 4 months. These communications outline in detail a coordinated strategy to disseminate targeted, misleading information regarding Sterling Industries' supply chain vulnerabilities. A strategy designed to induce a controlled panic among institutional investors, thereby creating the specific market conditions defined as a Class 3 market exigency, the very trigger for the Nightingale Protocol. This is a fabrication," Julian finally managed, his voice a ragged tear in the fabric of the room. He shot to his feet, a trembling finger aimed at Clara. "She's a plant, a corporate spy. Arthur, you've gone mad. You'd believe this. This nobody. Over me. Over 30 years. "Sit down, Julian," Arthur said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the immense, specific gravity of a collapsing star. It was a command, not a request, and Julian's body obeyed before his mind could rebel. He sank back into his chair, his collapse a confession in itself. "Proof is a funny thing, Julian," Arthur continued, his eyes never leaving the man he once called son. "It isn't always a smoking gun. Sometimes it's a pattern, a shadow, a name." He placed his phone gently on the polished redwood, the device looking small and insignificant. He tapped the screen, and then Eleanor's voice filled the room. It was not a recording played through a speaker. It was a presence. It was weak, threaded with the hiss of an oxygen machine, but it was luminous with a love that felt more real than the steel and glass surrounding them. Promise me it will be a place of healing, a legacy of kindness, our song in the night. The recording ended. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, profound, and damning. It was the sound of sacrilege. Every person in the room, even the predatory Marcus Thorne, seemed to shrink from it. Julian Vance did not move. He stared at the phone as if it were a serpent. The name, the sacred, private name of his benefactor's dying wish, had been his masterstroke, his most poetic cruelty. He had woven it into the heart of his betrayal, believing its sentimentality would blind the old man. Now that same sentiment had become his judge, jury, and executioner. You stood in the hospital room with me. Arthur's voice was a whisper now, a sound more terrifying than any roar. You held my hand. You told me you would help me honor her memory. And all the while, you were turning that memory into a key to a cage you were building for me. It was then that Julian finally broke, but it was not the explosive, screaming rage of a thwarted tyrant. It was something far more chilling. He began to laugh, a low, dry, rattling sound that was utterly devoid of humor. "Honor her?" he sneered, the mask of the devoted protégé finally melting away to reveal the curdled ambition beneath. "You honor a ghost. You've been running this company for a decade as a mausoleum for a dead woman. Every decision filtered through, what would Eleanor have wanted? She was a nurse, Arthur. She knew kindness, not capital. I built this empire with you. My sweat, my mind, my life is in every girder of this building. And what was my reward? To be your perpetual son, the brilliant boy who would never inherit the throne because it was already occupied by a memory." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "So yes, I used her name. I used the one thing you valued more than the company itself. It was the perfect leverage. It was elegant, and it would have worked, if not for this coffee-spilling phantom." His eyes, burning with a cold intellectual fury, found Clara. "Who are you? Really? What angel of mediocrity plucked you from your greasy spoon to ruin something so perfectly designed?" Before Clara could answer, Arthur spoke again, his voice regaining its steel. "She is the flaw in your perfect design, Julian. You accounted for everything. The board, the market, the lawyers, my grief. Everything but the unknown variable. The exhausted waitress who still remembers how to read. You thought you were smarter than everyone in this room. And you were. But you weren't smarter than everyone in the city." Arthur gave a short, sharp nod to the two men standing by the door. They were not FBI agents. They were his own men. There would be no sirens, no public spectacle. This was not a matter for the state. Not yet. This was a matter of the house, a cleansing. The men stepped forward. They did not rush. Their movements were calm, deliberate. Julian watched them approach, his laughter dying in his throat. The finality of it settled on him, not as a storm, but as a quiet, suffocating fog. He looked at Arthur, his face a canvas of dawning horror. He wasn't just being fired. He was being erased. "You can't," he whispered. "The company, it needs me." "The company needs to heal from you," Arthur said softly. As the men took his arms, Julian's gaze swept the room one last time, the terrified board members, the ashen-faced Thorne, the impassive lawyers. He was looking for an ally, a crack in the wall of condemnation. He found none. His empire of influence had vanished in the space of a single voicemail. As they led him to the door, a silent, defeated man, his hate-filled eyes met Clara's one last time. "You," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "You ruined everything." Clara met his gaze. She felt no triumph, only a profound and weary sadness. She reached into the pocket of her ill-fitting coat and pulled out the crumpled, coffee-stained apron from the lamplight diner. She held it up, not as a trophy, but as an answer. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You did. I just served the coffee." He was gone. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, the sound echoing with the finality of a tomb being sealed. A stunned silence remained. Arthur Sterling, who had stood like a colossus throughout the ordeal, finally let his shoulders slump. He walked to the vast window, turning his back on the room of broken men, and stared out at the city that had been his kingdom. He picked up the execution copy of the sales agreement from the table. He did not tear it. Tearing it would have been an act of passion, of anger. Instead, he simply let it drop from his fingers. It slid off the polished wood and landed on the plush carpet with a soft, insignificant whisper. "The 8 a.m. signing," he announced to the room, his voice heavy with the weight of the last 3 hours, "is postponed. Indefinitely." He turned, his eyes sweeping over the pale, sweating faces of his board and lawyers. "This is Ms. Clara Evans. She will be coordinating an independent internal investigation into this matter. I expect your full, unreserved cooperation. You may consider your positions on this board under review." He didn't wait for a response. He walked to the door. "Clara," he said, his voice softer now. A moment. She followed him out, leaving the wreckage behind. They stood in the silent, opulent hallway. The adrenaline that had sustained her began to ebb, and a deep, bone-aching exhaustion washed over her. She was suddenly aware of the coffee stain on her uniform, the ache in her feet, the fact she hadn't slept in 36 hours. Arthur looked at her, his sharp blue eyes filled not with gratitude or triumph, but with a deep, bottomless sorrow. "He was my son, Clara, in all the ways that mattered, and I never saw the rot." "You saw what he wanted you to see," she said quietly. "You saw the person you helped create. And you saw the truth," he countered. He reached into his jacket and produced a checkbook and his Mont Blanc pen. "I owe you a debt I can never repay, but I can start. Your father. The clinic. Whatever it costs. Write the number." He offered her the open checkbook. Clara looked at the blank check, a passport to a world without worry, the solution to every problem that had haunted her for 5 years. She thought of her father, of the bills, of the nights spent crying in her tiny apartment. And then she thought of the man in the boardroom, his perfect design, his belief that everyone and everything had a price. Slowly she shook her head. "No, thank you, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "That's not how this works. I didn't do this for a reward. I did it because it was wrong. What you did to my father, what he was doing to you, it was the same disease, a betrayal of trust that eats you from the inside out." Arthur stared at her, a flicker of profound respect dawning in his tired eyes. He slowly closed the checkbook. "Then what do you want, Miss Evans?" "I want to go home," she said, the words a simple, aching truth. "I want to check on my father. And then, I want to sleep." He nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "My car is downstairs. It will take you wherever you need to go. Rest, Clara. And when you wake up, we'll talk about what comes next. For both of us." 6 months later, The first snow of winter was falling on the city, each flake a quiet promise of silence and renewal. Stirling Tower still stood, a beacon on the skyline, but inside it was a different place. The market frenzy had passed. Arthur, with a ruthlessness that shocked Wall Street, had purged the company. The compromised board members were gone. A new, younger, more scrupulous leadership team was in place. The company was smaller, leaner, but it was honest. It was his again. But Arthur Sterling was not in his tower. He was standing in a small, meticulously kept cemetery in Westchester, a single white rose in his hand. The snow dusted the simple granite headstone that read, "Eleanor Sterling, beloved wife, our song in the night." "He took a plea, my love," Arthur said, quietly, his breath misting in the cold air. 15 years. Thorne got 10. The company is safe. But that's not what I came to tell you. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and gently placed the rose on the cold stone. I came to tell you that I was wrong. I thought my legacy was the steel, the stock price, the name on the building. I thought that's what I was protecting. For you. For us. But I was just protecting my own pride. Julian was right about one thing. I had turned our life's work into a monument, a cold, perfect thing. I forgot that its purpose was to build things that helped people live. He looked up at the grey sky. I almost lost it all, Eleanor. Not to him. To my own blindness. But then a strange thing happened. A miracle, I suppose. In the darkest hour, in the most unlikely of places, I heard our song again, faintly, from a different voice. Miles away, in a quiet, sunlit room, in a state-of-the-art neurological clinic in Connecticut, Clara Evans sat holding her father's hand. The room didn't smell of despair or disinfectant, but of lemon polish and fresh flowers. Her father was asleep, his breathing peaceful. The lines of stress on his face, etched there by years of confusion and fear, had softened. The doctors said the new treatments weren't a cure, but a reprieve. They were giving him back moments, slivers of clarity. Yesterday, he had looked at a picture of her late mother and called her by name. Clara hadn't taken a C-suite job. She had refused the title of Chief Strategy Officer, the corner office, the 7-figure salary. Instead, she had made a counteroffer, using a seed grant from Arthur, not as a payment, but as an investment. She had established the new, independent legal arm of the Eleanor Nightingale Foundation. It was housed not in the glittering Stirling Tower, but in a modest, refurbished brownstone downtown. They called it the Evans Wing. Her clients were not corporations, they were people. People tangled in the fine print of insurance denials, predatory loan agreements, and eviction notices. People like she had been, drowning in the language of a system designed to crush them. She and her small team of young, idealistic lawyers were their translators, their advocates, their shield. She didn't read contracts to find poison pills for billionaires anymore. She read them to find lifelines for the forgotten. The work was grueling, the victories small, but her exhaustion was different now. It was the satisfying ache of purpose, not the hollow fatigue of despair. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Arthur. "Are you here?" She texted back. "Room 214. He's sleeping." A few minutes later, Arthur appeared at the door, holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the hospital cafeteria. He looked older than he had 6 months ago, but the haunted look was gone from his eyes. It had been replaced by a quiet calm. He handed her a cup. "How is he?" he asked, his voice low. "He's good today," she smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. He had blueberry pancakes for breakfast, told the nurse a joke he probably last told in 1982. "That's good," Arthur said, sipping his coffee. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the snow fall outside the window. "The Foundation's annual report came out," he said. "The Evans wing has a 92% success rate in case mediation. You're becoming a legend in the non-profit world." Clara shrugged, a faint blush on her cheeks. "We're just getting started. There are a lot of contracts in the world, Arthur." "I know," he said. He looked from her father, sleeping peacefully, to her. He saw the woman from the diner, but she was no longer a ghost. The exhaustion was still there, but it was the weariness of a warrior after a righteous fight, not a victim of circumstance. "You know," Arthur said, a wistful note in his voice, "I kept the page, the one from the agreement, the one you spilled coffee on." He'd had it framed, not on the boardroom wall for public display, but on the desk in his private study. A quiet, personal reminder. For the longest time, I thought the stain was a symbol of the mess, the chaos that almost ruined me. But I was looking at it wrong. He turned to her, his gaze clear and direct. It wasn't a stain. It was an edit, a clumsy, human, necessary correction. It reminded me that perfection is a myth, that sometimes the most important truths are found not in the pristine text, but in the margins, in the interruptions, in the spills. Clara looked at the coffee in her own hand, then at Arthur. The titan of industry, the waitress. Two worlds, two lives, that had collided in the pre-dawn gloom of a greasy spoon diner. They hadn't just saved a company. They had, in their own quiet ways, saved each other. "To the spills, then," she said softly, raising her paper cup. Arthur Sterling smiled, a true and gentle smile, and touched his cup to hers. To the spills. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a clean, quiet white, offering a chance for everything to begin again.